Due to outdated and ineffective technologies in our electricity grid, our transmission lines are not being used to their full potential, which raises your electricity bill. That needs to change. It is because Matic and I believe that our transmission grid needs a substantial upgrade that we stand with the resolution today. The result, the United States federal government should substantially reform its energy policy. Let's go to background point 1. You can write this down as transmission line congestion. Transmission lines are the huge steel structures carrying power lines, and they're used to transport vast amounts of electricity over long distances. Their job is simple, to get energy from power plants to the areas with demand. These are not to be confused with distribution lines, which are the smaller lines along the side of the road that receive power from the transmission lines and distribute the energy among populated areas. You can think about transmission lines like the highway of the grid, while distribution systems are the smaller city streets. The problem is that just like our highways, transmission systems often get congested, as we see in subpoint A, congestion. The International Renewable Energy Agency writes in 2020, grid congestion occurs when network components reach their thermal limits due to large electricity flows. Every transmission line has a limit on how much energy it can send before it overheats and damages equipment. So oftentimes, to prevent overheating, we lower the amount of energy we send down the line. The problem? The supply of electricity is lowered, and due to supply and demand economics, prices go up. This leads to ever-increasing costs for the consumer, as seen in subpoint B, $20.8 billion lost. Talking about annual costs from congestion, Grid Strategies writes in July of 2023, they say, extrapolate to the rest of the US, including queso, congestion costs totaled $20.8 billion. Almost all of these losses are paid for by the consumer. And on top of that, congestion costs have been increasing exponentially over the last few years. And the negative effects don't stop at wasted money. Subpoint C, critical power cut. The Washington Post writes in June 29th of 2021, when they say, in the punishing heat wave that has struck the Pacific Northwest, about 17,000 electricity customers were without power in Washington State on Monday evening. Nearly 20,000 more were in blackouts in Idaho, Oregon, California, and Nevada. Those aren't devastating numbers, but they are a reminder that the electric grid in America is frayed and always operating close to the edge. Later on they say, but perhaps the central issue is chronic congestion on the transmission lines that bring power from where it's made to where it's wanted. During times of high demand, we are often unable to meet that demand due to a lack of transmission line capacity, leading to critical power cuts. This isn't isolated to the Pacific Northwest. No matter where you are, congestion prevents the reliable flow of electricity, creating two unique harms. The first being higher electricity prices, and the second, in some instances, meaning that we cannot get electricity whatsoever. The problem is seen in our background point 2, ambient adjusted rating. Let's take a look at how the US federal government is currently addressing this issue. Subpoint A, rating system. When carrying energy, transmission lines have something called a rating system to determine how much electricity they're able to transport based on numerous factors, such as temperature, weather, and materials used within the lines. This is necessary because otherwise we're either sending too little energy down the line and wasting our transmission capacity, or sending too much and causing them to overheat. Subpoint B, federally required. Talking about ambient adjusted ratings, or AARs for short, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, also known as FERC, writes, Order number 881 directs transmission providers to use ambient adjusted ratings as the basis for evaluating near-term transmission service, as well as for the determination of the necessity of certain curtailment, interruption, or redispatch of near-term transmission service. All transmission lines must use AARs, but this is falling short of our energy needs, as seen in subpoint C, not dynamic. The Department of Energy writes, although some transmission owners consider ambient adjusted ratings to be dynamic, ambient adjusted ratings are not considered true dynamic because the only time-sensitive data they consider is ambient air temperature measurements. The flaw with AARs is pretty simple. The only dynamic or live sensor data they rely on is air temperature. This makes their estimations often flawed, as they don't take into account things like wind quality, leaving lots of our transmission line capacity underutilized. The solution is seen in background point 3, dynamic line ratings. You can think about dynamic line ratings, or DLRs, as just an AER system, but with a better comprehensive sensor array. The Electricity Energy TNT magazine writes in February of 2024, dynamic line rating. DLR uses sensors installed on critical sections of power line, or attached to the transmission towers to constantly collect data on parameters such as current, SAB, conductor temperature, and wind speed. Algorithms use this real-time information combined with weather data to accurately estimate the capacity of the line. In simple terms, DLRs are just AARs that take more factors into account, making its measurements and ratings more accurate. This leads us to our plan, require DLRs. Our mandate is to require that all overhead transmission lines in FERC-regulated states utilize radio communication dynamic line ratings per the definition in the 1AC by the end of fiscal year 2026. Our agency and enforcement are FERC and all other necessary bodies in the U.S. federal government, and our timeline is upon an affirmative ballot. Our funding is none, as the companies themselves will pay for the DLRs. However, any unforeseen costs will come from the Department of Energy's budget, which will be increased appropriately with all the necessary funds. Let's now go down to our justification to explain why we solve for that harm. Our justification you can write down as decreased congestion. We've already shown that congestion is a massive, unaddressed problem. Let's take a look at what DLRs do to solve that. Subpoint A, more factors. Without a DLR, transmission systems don't know that they're being cooled by wind and allow a standard amount of energy to go through the line. With DLRs, it takes into account that the wind will prevent the lines from overheating, thus allowing us to send more electricity down the line without any consequences. And this isn't just isolated to wind. There are numerous other factors that only DLRs considers, making it far superior to its alternatives. Subpoint B, increased capacity. Comparing DLRs with SLRs, the old system utilized before ARs were required, the International Council on Large Electricity Systems writes in July of 2021. They said, on average, DLR provides 33.8% greater capacity in summer and 19.3% greater capacity in winter than SLR, while mitigating the risk of exceeding maximum operating temperature. AR provides 15.1% greater capacity in summer and 2.7% greater capacity in winter, with a risk of overstaying ratings. DLR provides 16.3% greater capacity in the summer over AAR and 16.2% greater capacity over AAR in the winter. Now, that's a lot of percentages in math, but the bottom line here is that during any time of year, DLRs at least provide 16% more capacity than ARs, which solves for congestion. As we see in our impact, significant savings. Talking about a study they conducted on a congested transmission line, Sean Murphy, a PhD in electrical engineering and power systems, writes in March 30th of 2021. He says, assuming $500,000 installation cost, 8.4 to 1 benefit to cost ratio for 1 year. All congestion in target line eliminated. Residual congestion pushed downstream, consistent with other transmission upgrade projects. You see, because transmission companies are required to price their electricity based on its actual cost, these 8 to 1 savings are mostly passed on to the consumer. They're allowed to keep enough to pay for the systems so the companies don't get hurt. But we also benefit the consumers, ensuring fair electricity prices for you and a reliable grid for every single American. Thank you.
So I've got a couple of questions. Can we agree to just a general standard of responsible policy since I was asked for by the judges?
It depends on what you mean by responsible policy.
Okay, if it can meet what the judges believe to be a federally responsible policy, what you can actually see the federal government passing, we can agree that's just a general standard we should operate by.
Sure, if it meets the judge's standard for being a good policy, I think the judges should vote for it, yes.
Okay, but meeting the federal standard, federally responsible.
The federal standard is usually that they conduct a million studies and they have congressmen pass it. So no, we cannot meet that standard because we aren't congressmen.
Okay, interesting. So do companies have to pay an upfront price for this?
Correct, they do need to pay for the systems.
Okay, but they pay for this upfront. I just want to be really clear.
Yes, they do.
Okay, how much does it cost?
For each transmission line, it costs about $500,000.
Okay, and what companies are actually implementing this? Are these grid operators? Are these the power plants? Like what companies?
Whoever owns the transmission lines is responsible for it.
So the grid operators?
Yes, usually the regional transmission operators, the independent system operators, there are a bunch of different types.
You would agree grid operators never actually put technology on and instead make the power plants do that, correct?
They can hire different companies to do so. That's how the AR implementation works.
Okay, but, okay, interesting. I'll let you go with that one. Friends, so you're implementing this only on hard grid related by 2026. Do you have any proof that your plan can actually be implemented by 2026? Because that's a pretty early deadline.
Yes, we have evidence from VERVE themselves saying that every company is mandated to have the ability to easily install and use DLRs, and we also have evidence saying that they can be installed within months.
Okay, so you just said it's mandated they all have DLRs.
No, that they have the ability to install DLRs. The same sentence that we have evidence for that says that DLRs are required, but they need the ability to install them.
Okay, so they need to have the ability to sell them already in that status quo. What's stopping them?
It's the fact that they are monopolies who love price gouging the consumer, and there's also something called rate making. If they decrease prices for consumers, they need to pass on all the benefits to consumers, and they only keep enough to pay for the systems.
Interesting. We can agree that when a company has to upgrade a transmission line, they are responsible for the full upfront cost, correct?
Yes, unless they can get investors to pay for them or take out bank loans.
Okay, yeah, absolutely. And in the status quo, they've always gone with what's cheapest and generally most effective, ignoring DLRs, of course.
When they are forced to make transmission upgrades, yes, that is the case.
Okay, interesting. And it's your contention that grid operators are going to have to build this themselves.
They're not going to build it. They can easily hire independent companies that produce and install DLRs to do it for them.
Interesting. No further questions.
We'll be starting in 5 minutes. Good evening to all my visitors. I'm not sure why, but at this tournament, I have made my driving an issue of almost every debate I've been. But specifically, if I was to buy a car and expect it to be profitable for me, I need a few things for that. First of all, I need the upfront capital to buy it. I need the know-how to use it, and that car would actually have to be effective for it to be a worthwhile purchase. All of these things which are inherent within my current car are not inherent with the affirmative team's plan. So let's actually get into some burdens, some solvency, some disadvantages, and overall reasons why the negative team should warrant your ballot today. Let's get into those burdens. There are 2 here that I'd like to start off with, and then I'll develop one further in my speech. The 2 you can write down right now, though, are that companies will foot costs. Again, companies will foot costs. In order for the affirmative team today to prove to you that these companies will actually be able to implement these, they have to show you not only are they able to foot these costs, but they will. What's the impact here? Unproven. Again, unproven. Until they can prove this to you today, they cannot warrant your ballot because there's no proof these companies will actually be implementing them. Now, I'm going to talk about this further, but the second burden here is that companies can implement. Again, companies can implement. Even if these companies do have the upfront capital for this, if they don't have the know-how nor the tools to actually do it, there's no way it can be reasonably implemented if you pass the affirmative team ballot. I'm going to be developing both of these through a solvency and disadvantage. So let's get into that first solvency, and that is specifically unable to implement. Again, unable to implement. Now the interesting thing about the status quo is while DLRs are in some places used, for the most part that's not the case. And the problem with just switching from normal detection systems to DLRs is that the word dynamic is very real here. It's far more complicated to upkeep these, and most companies don't actually have not only the knowledge but the capacity to do that. Subpoint A is not widely adopted. Again, not widely adopted. And I think we both agree on this, but I'm still going to read a piece about it. According to the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission on May of 2020, quote, non-RTO/ISO transmission owners generally implement seasonal line ratings. Aside from these standard practices, there have been several pilot projects to test the development and potential application of DLRs. For the most part, though, these DLRs have not been deployed in a real-time system or market operations. End quote. What is this saying? It's saying that while we have limited use of these systems in the status quo, by and by, they are still in an experimental phase and most companies don't actually know what to do with them. What's the impact here? The impact is simply not widely adopted. Again, not widely adopted. There's no reason to assume that these companies can just start using these systems despite the fact that they are experimental. And that's the second impact. Experimental. These systems are inherently experimental within the status quo. That's why they've not been mandated yet. Maybe in the future, when companies actually know how to utilize them, we could do this, but not right now. That's why this is so irresponsible. Subpoint B is not widely understood. Again, not widely understood. Due to its experimental nature, this technology is not widely understood by these companies, which would be paramount in actual operation of them. According to the U.S. Department of Energy, for a report to Congress in June of 2019, They say, quote, in a New York Power Authority DLR demonstration, the learning curve and trust in measurement accuracy were identified as challenges that might cause system operators to avoid adopting DLR. In addition to the learning curve as challenges, introducing DLR systems would require the integration of a new terminal and additional training for employees. More importantly, a dedicated effort to ensure the system is providing accurate real-time information is required. Transmission operator feedback also suggests that they've had limited time to make complex decisions and need intuitive information, especially in emergency situations. End quote. What does this say? It's saying that when we tested these in New York, what we saw is that line operators didn't really know how to use them. There was a massive learning curve, and when actual loads were increased, like the harm that the affirmative team is claiming, they didn't actually know what to do because they weren't truly trained. What's the impact of this? Cannot implement. Again, cannot implement. They cannot claim any of their benefits if these companies are simply going to take this technology and improperly use it, which is guaranteed because we've seen that with not only past precedents, but simply the fact that it's not even used in the market today. Now let's actually talk about that part where I was talking about the second burden, or rather first, funding. And this will be a disadvantage here, and that is simply companies crippled. Again, companies crippled. Now, I've already talked about specifically how these companies can't really properly use this technology. And the great part about the affirmative team's claim that these will pay for themselves within time is that's assuming these companies can actually use them effectively. Subpoint A, again, is that simply wishful thinking. Again, cost savings, wishful thinking. The idea that we're going to be saving costs because these are so accurate and they're so great for our grid is wishful thinking if these companies can't actually use them effectively. According to the Department of Energy in June of 2019, they say, quote, the accuracy and reliability of a DLR is critical to successful deployment and realization of cost savings, but inaccuracies can arise through both measurement and modeling errors. Measurement errors include imprecise or inconsistent measurements and improperly calibrated direct measurement sensors. DLR systems can also malfunction in whole or in part, such as during the loss of communications connectivity. Additionally, some direct measurement sensors are not able to measure transition line parameters accurately during periods of light loading. End quote. What is this saying? It's saying that because of the error in these systems and because the error of users, they're not actually fully able to see the costs of these things actually realized. But subpoint B is up to $1 million per line. Again, up to $1 million per line. Now they read this piece in the YAC, a study specifically saying that they assumed that the cost per line would be $500,000. But that's just an assumption. What would the cost actually be realistically? Well, it could be up to $1 million per line. According to Debbie Andrews, writing for the Federal Register, February 24th of 2022. Quote, for example, BPA asserted that DLR implementation would require investment of potentially over $1 million per transmission line in monitoring equipment, software, and hardware to submit and host the data. What are the impacts of this? The first impact is cost benefit not realized. Again, cost benefit not realized. The benefit that these companies will actually be getting from these systems are completely unrealized because of its experimental nature. And the second impact here, though, is simply unable to foot. Again, unable to foot. If these companies are unable to foot these costs, there's no way they can actually implement this in the status quo. So what do we see here? We see that this is an experimental technology that has not been tested on wide-scale markets and as an industry is not well understood. We've then seen that this will cost these companies lots of money that they don't actually have, and that the cost benefits that the affirmative team claimed are entirely moot without proper training, guidance, and etc., which is not being provided for the affirmative team. It's all of these reasons that I would urge a negative ballot at the end of today's debate. Thank you so much, guys. And I've been open for 3 minutes of cross.
All right, 3 minutes. Let's get off here with your impact of not widely adopted. You'd agree that this is completely true because otherwise our case would be in error, right?
Yeah, it's not widely adopted in the status quo.
Okay, so if it were widely adopted, then our case would be in error, right? Sure. Okay, awesome. Let's go into your impact about how it's experimental. When in the evidence did it actually say it's experimental?
I can grab that piece right now. Let me grab it right.
Okay.
Okay, so specifically it says, aside from these standard practices, there have been several pilot projects to test the developmental and potential applications of DLRs. So it doesn't actually say experimental, it says developmental. If I misconstrued that, that's my own.
Okay, interesting. Let's go into your argument about how we need training in technology. You agree that we give them over 2 years to implement this technology, and there's plenty of time for utilities to train their workers, correct?
I would not agree that that is plenty of time. Like I said, these are developmental technologies,
Okay.
and that piece saying it's, yeah.
Okay, you'd agree that in our 1AC we said we're using algorithms for DLRs, correct? Sure. Okay, so the algorithms do most of the calculations. The people just need to make sure that nothing gets destroyed, right?
Again, like a piece I brought up, specifically, I do believe it was from the Department of Energy. Like I said, that user error significantly impacts the effectiveness of the system.
Okay, it references a New York Power Authority DLR demonstration. Even though the evidence that was quoting this demonstration was from 2019, when was that actual demonstration from?
I do not believe it said in the piece. If you'd like to see that piece, you can see that.
Okay, awesome. Let's go further into your argument. You talked about how essentially it will cost $1 million per line. You be at the estimate of $500,000 is half of $1 million, correct? Sure. Okay, let's assume that we're doubling the cost in our 8-to-1 benefit to cost ratio. You agree that would still be a 4-to-1 benefit to cost ratio, correct?
I mean, sure, but again, there's no reason to believe this would actually happen in the field.
Okay, and why is that?
Because, again, these are not necessarily going to be used as effectively as you claim.
Okay.
In theory, there could be cost benefits, but not in the real.
Okay, so as long as we can prove that DLRs actually solve for the harms, then they will be able to pay for the system.
I'm not necessarily going to agree to that. My partner's going to get into some more analysis,
Okay, but as it currently stands, that's what the analysis shows.
but not necessarily.
Why is that?
Because, again, like I said, there are other.
Okay, let's go into your subpoint A of the disadvantage of wishful thinking, where the DOE basically just said we can't fully implement DLR because they're bad technology. When did they actually conduct a real-world study that proved that this was the case?
Okay, so what that piece actually said is that when we actually tried it in the real world, it failed because of these operators.
Is it okay if we take a specific look at that piece and you point out where to in the subpoint A of this disadvantage it actually mentions the test?
That is no.
Okay, but I was specifically asking about disadvantage subpoint A. So, is it
The one
okay?
about the New York study, or
No, the subpoint A of wishful thinking where it said that it can have bad data. Where in that did it actually say in the real world there was bad data from DLRs?
let me actually find that piece. I do believe what it was saying though is that specifically that's just how they inherently work.
Okay, so getting more factors and getting more information inherently means more inaccurate data.
Used by operators improperly. Yes.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. Is it okay if I steal your items?
Yeah.
Awesome, thank you. Starting at 5.
Eight minutes if you guys are ready. And if my entire panel is ready. All right, let's go ahead and get started. While I was waiting for breaks, I was sitting in the cafeteria having some dinner with my friends and eating some really good food. But I was also drinking a really tall glass of chocolate milk. And I got really caught up in how good my food was that I really lost track of time. And then I saw someone text me, "You broke, you need to get ready right now." And as I saw that, I'm like, wow, I need to get to the student room right now. So I picked up my food and just ran as fast as I could to go put it in that, whatever that rotating conveyor belt thing is. And as I was doing that, all I was thinking about is how fast I need to go. What I was not taking into account is that I had a full glass of chocolate milk. As a result of that, I spilled all that chocolate milk all over my pants. So if you see weird splotches on my pants, that is not me wetting myself or anything. That is chocolate milk. But the point here is that the only thing I was considering is how fast I needed to get to the student room. I wasn't considering other key factors that contribute to what I should do in that moment. That's exactly what DLRs actually are. Right now, we're limited to only one factor. We need more factors in order to actually have an effective policy. Now, I want to get into some of the responses to what they said in the last speech. First, I want to address both burdens that they brought up. They essentially said companies will foot costs, and then they said essentially companies you can tag my response as harm/solvency. Again, harm/solvency. These are essentially both points that are contesting whether we solve our harm or not. Yes, we can agree the burden of the affirmative team is to prove that we have a harm, that something bad is going on in the status quo, and that we solve that harm. These are not like specific things that are applicable to every round, but what is applicable to every round is harm/solvency. So I believe both teams can agree. Let's move on to their solvency of unable to implement. You can tag my response as simple to implement. Again, simple to implement. Subpoint A you can tag as FERC order enabled. Again, FERC order enabled. Now this is specifically talking about the FERC Order 881, which is the same requirement that required all companies to use AARs within the current system. We referenced this in the 1AC, and you can take a look at this evidence if you if you don't think it's talking about that. But this is according to VERVE themselves on December 16th of 2021. They say, quote, while the final rule does not mandate the adoption of dynamic line ratings that account for other factors like wind speed, the rule does require that organized market operations establish and maintain systems and procedures necessary to allow transmission owners that would like to use dynamic line ratings the ability to do so, end quote. So essentially what this piece of evidence is saying, that while we don't require DLRs to actually be implemented in the first place, we require that all of these companies maintain their necessary technology and necessary procedures that if they actually want to implement dynamic line ratings, they have the ability to do so. That includes things like training, that includes things like system operation. Those are all included under this order. What is the impact of this card? The impact you can write down is able to implement. Again, able to implement. Currently, they are able to implement because they're required to do so. Subpoint B you can tag as hire other companies. Again, hire other companies. Let's say that they aren't keeping up with the standard that's set forth by VERVE, and they need someone to come and help them implement this into their system and help train their operators. They are perfectly able to hire any of the companies that actually develop dynamic line ratings in order to do this. Subpoint C you can tag as halfway there. Again, halfway there. This is according to Kwok Chung, who has a PhD degree in electrical engineering from the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers on March 27th of 2023. He says, quote, order number 881 requires transmission providers to implement ambient adjusted ratings to determine the maximum transfer capacity of their transmission lines for near-term transmission services. Later on, he goes down to say, AAR can be considered a significant step towards DLRs for improved market efficiency, end quote. What's the ultimate gist of what this is saying? It's essentially saying this is the first step in allowing companies to implement DLRs. Because why, you might ask? Because they already have a sensor, it's just one sensor, so they already know how to install sensors because they're required to do that in the status quo. It's also the same kind of technology that's used under DLRs. It's just under DLRs, they're taking more factors into account. So it's essentially the first step to implementation, and they are perfectly able to do this. But now let's move on to their impacts under this. They talk about how it's not widely adopted. So once again, we can agree. Our case is not inherent, trust me. Their second impact was experimental. You can tag my response as empirics. Again, empirics. Let's look at an empiric that is specifically from Arena NC's and Francisco Pasha from the International Renewable Energy Agency in 2020. They say, quote, DLR implemented by ALEA, the TSO in Belgium resulted in a 30% increase in a line's current, end quote. So essentially this was implemented into a transmission system operator, which is what a TSO is, in Belgium, and it resulted in a 30% increase, which coincidentally coincides with the evidence that we read in the 1AC, said that results in a 30% increase. But now let's move on to their subpoint B, which is of not widely understood. You can tag my response as must be accurate. Again, must be accurate. All of the evidence that was read here was saying, oh, the data has to be accurate. It never said that the data isn't accurate. Yes, we can agree the data has to be accurate, but I'd like to point out that this is real-time data. This isn't something that they're calculating about the future. This is something that's happening in the here and now. So essentially, if there's wind blowing, they take into account how fast that wind is blowing, how that's affecting the line, and they send that to the technology. My third response you can tag is algorithms, not humans. Again, algorithms, not humans. This was clarified in cross-examination. We're specifically requiring algorithms to do this, not humans. My fourth response and final response you can tag is 2 years to train. Again, 2 years to train. DLRs only take a couple months to implement, therefore there's an extra year given under our plan for even if this is required for them to be able to be trained. But now let's move on to their disadvantage of companies crippled. Subpoint A was of wishful thinking. We've tagged my first response as hypothetical. Again, hypothetical. This evidence was not talking about a real-world study. It was not talking about any actual examples of this actually being tested. Second response you can tag is anything can malfunction. Again, anything can malfunction. All their evidence said is, oh, DLRs can malfunction. I completely agree. So can my phone. So can my heart. Does that mean that I'm going to die? No. Anything can malfunction. That's completely non-unique. Now let's move down to their subpoint B of up to 1 million per line. You can tag my response as real-world implementation preferred. Again, real-world implementation preferred. This was a hypothetical study, and you guys asked for reasons to prefer for evidence. The evidence that we gave within the 1AC, talking about 500K per line, that was done in the real world, so they actually know how much it took. That should be preferred. The second response you can tag as even if, still 4 to 1. Again, even if, still 4 to 1. Even if you take their evidence into account and you favor it over our evidence and it costs $1 million, then that 8 to 1 evidence just means it's now 4 to 1. We're still getting 4 times the benefits than we are the costs. Now let's move on to the impacts. Their impact 1 was of cost benefit not realized and unable to foot. I have two responses to both of these. You can tag your first response as can pay for. Again, can pay for. There's one more piece of evidence I want to read here, which is according to, this is according to the U.S. Department of Energy in June of 2019. They say, quote, while DLR can lead to cost savings, these savings may not accrue to the financial benefit of transmission owners in the U.S. to sufficiently incentivize them to deploy such systems and other advanced transmission technologies, e.g. power flow controllers. This is due in part to the financial regulatory structure of rate-regulated utilities. Transmission owners generally can recover their prudentially incurred expenditures for transmission under FERC's rules, end quote. So essentially, they're allowed to keep however much it costs to implement the system. So since there's 4 times the benefit, they're allowed to keep that $1 million that it costs them to implement the system. Second response, you can tag as loans. Again, loans. Even if they aren't able to implement this with their own money, they're able to take out loans. Companies do this all the time. My third response, I'm adding an extra response, you're welcome. My third response, you can tag as only 4 lines per company. Only 4 lines per company. There are many transmission companies throughout the United States, and most of them only own an average of 4 lines, meaning this is relatively cheap and not going to be an issue. Thank you so much.
We have 3 minutes on the clock if my panel's ready. So,
Yep.
Let's start off with your intro. Is chocolate milk tasty?
It is very tasty. That's why I was drinking it.
Alright, let's get to the actual questions. So, did you bring any evidence that these companies actually have the upfront cost?
Yes, our evidence simply says that they have an 8-to-1 benefit to cost ratio. So let's assume that they don't have the upfront costs. They can take out a loan, and then they can pay back what it is cost through the benefits that are created. You never responded to the 8-to-1 benefit to cost ratio card, therefore that is accepted as true as of now.
Okay, so is it your contention that you are mandating companies to take out government loans?
I don't know exactly what you mean by government loans. They do. Most of these companies are able to implement this, as it's said within the evidence. But even if they aren't, they are able to take out loans. That's how companies start up. Not every company is able to be profitable immediately, so they take out a loan and then they pay it off later on. This is pretty simple in how companies work all the time.
So is your contention that if these companies don't have the upfront cost, they'll just have to take out a loan and that's what they pay for it?
Correct.
Okay, awesome. Just wanted to get that very clear. Now, do you believe that the DOE has great insight on this industry?
The DOE is kind of hit and miss. I would generally say that they have good reference knowledge on what their own laws are, not necessarily what the industry is like.
Okay. You talked about your study that you brought up in the one I see, saying how it was about $500,000 per line. Was that study actually determining the cost of these, or was it just assuming the cost and furthering the study with that?
It was determining the cost and the benefits. There was a graph included under the 1AC that listed out all of the parts that would need to be purchased in order to implement the system, and how much those things actually cost, and how much savings we got from those after 1 year. You can look at that piece of evidence in that graph. It lists out all the specific parts and the comparison between DLR case and the base case, which is AARs.
Okay, so how many DLRs are actually implemented in the status quo?
In the status quo, do you mean like how many companies use them or how many individual systems?
Just how many individuals?
How many individual systems? I do not know. I know that, once again, I brought up that the TSO in Belgium uses them. Within the United States, I believe some of the Texas grid uses it, and I know some of New York's grid uses it. I don't know how many individual sensors that's made up of.
Okay, you talked about how we're giving them essentially 2 years to train their employees and that's much time. Did you bring up any evidence behind this claim?
Yes, or my evidence is just what our mandate says. It gives them 2 years. They're able to train them within that 2 years. There's no evidence saying that 2 years isn't enough. And as my further responses showed, we don't even have to train them in the first place because they're already required to be trained, and they're algorithms that are being used and not humans.
Okay, no further questions.
All right, thanks.
My judges are ready. Got 8 minutes on the clock, and I'll begin. Now, when you go back to the room after this debate, I need you to ask yourself something, and I want you to ask yourself this very seriously. When you are deciding who to vote for, you need to ask yourself if you think the federal government would do this, because that's what you're acting as in the resolution today. If you think the federal government would do this, they won't. And I think the best way for us to show you that the federal government wouldn't do this, thus failing the goal of team policy, is to cite what the federal government has said about the topic. which is exactly what I'm going to be doing today. Because actually we'll see from multiple federal studies that DLRs are not ready to be implemented for many reasons, which is what I'm going to be getting to. First off, with a background point, what we've included. Again, what we've included. Now, my opponents have said that FERC Order 881 essentially allowed for other standards. Let me explain what they also included. And this is from FERC on January 13th, 2022. Quote, while DLRs can represent more accurate transmission line ratings than AARs, based on the record in this proceeding, we decline to mandate DLRs implementation in this final rule. We instead incorporate the record in this proceeding on DLRs into docket number, your numbers, which we open to further explore DLR implementation, end quote. So essentially, they've set it aside to reconsider, but why? That's a really important question. And that's my subpoint B, which you can write down as the reason. Again, the reason. And this is from the Department of Energy 2019. Quote, numerous power grid stakeholders have also expressed support for DLR, but technical, market, and regulatory challenges remain that must be addressed to facilitate broader adoption. Further research is needed to better understand the economic benefits, costs, and impacts of widespread DLR adoption, especially at the regional or national level, end quote. So our government itself is saying we need to consider a lot of different factors, but I'm not just coming up here and saying, well, the affirmative should tell us every standard they should meet. I'm going to tell you exactly what that is. And that's going to be in my next point, which you can write down, is one of many DOE conclusions. Again, one of many DOE conclusions. And this is from the Department of Energy, same source. Quote, this is one example of how DLR data can be made actionable. DOE has funded research on alternative ways to more effectively present DLR data to system operators. Overall, standardization of DLR data use and a baseline of expected functionality and performance will be needed to facilitate control room integration, end quote. So, what this is saying is that the DOE is funding this, trying to make sure DLRs are getting further benefited and upgraded to actually be actionable because of control room integration. Now, I'm going to get into that in a minute, but what I really want this impact to be for you is federal government addressing. Again, federal government addressing. Now, the harms my opponents have talked about is saying that the federal government has done nothing about this and we just have AARs in the system and they're just letting us get screwed over by $20.8 billion. They're not doing that. The federal government is investing and trying to make sure this is actionable, and it's whether you think the federal government should be perfectly persuaded of this, which has been failed by the DOE. Now let me explain what those standards are, and this can be written down as a solvency point, not meeting standards. Again, not meeting the standards. And this is first from Simon Smith, writing for ISP on October 23rd, 2023. Quote, one significant drawback of smart grid systems is the limited cybersecurity measures in place. In today's interconnected world, where cyber threats are becoming increasingly sophisticated, it is crucial to ensure the security of critical infrastructure such as the power grid. Smart grid systems, which rely heavily on digital communication and data exchange, are vulnerable to cyber attacks. Hackers could potentially gain unauthorized access to the system, manipulate data, disrupt operations, and even cause physical damage, end quote. So, what this is saying is smart grid systems, like DLRs, aren't developed enough because of cybersecurity threats. Now, these are unique from AARs because when the federal government was weighing this, they said, wow, we should probably not put something that hackers could hack into and shut down our whole grid. Now, don't just take this person's word for it, you can also take the Department of Energy's word for it. When they said, quote, as utilities and system operators begin to rely on DLR systems for control, dispatch, and market decisions, the communications channel becomes a critical asset and will need to meet NERC's critical infrastructure protection standards and requirements to ensure the authenticity and integrity of DLR data. Corruption of this data from any cause, unintentional or deliberate, becomes an operational problem that can have significant consequences, end quote. So what this is saying is that this is actually failing current standards for the grid, and because it's not meeting the current standards, we cannot implement them. It's not even just should you, it's the federal government has concluded that they cannot meet the standards, so they can't. This isn't just a disadvantage, this is literally a you're not allowed to sort of thing. The affirmative team is not allowed to implement that because it's not meeting the NERC standards. Now, I think that alone should warrant a negative ballot, but there's a lot more that I really want to implement, or not implement, but impact. And it's that they haven't changed these standards. Again, haven't changed these standards. When you read the affirmative mandates, All they're saying is we put ELRs in the system. They do not say we should have re-studies, we should look at where they should be implemented, how they should be implemented, put in control room integration standards, or anything else. They're just saying, put them in, get her done. And there's another problem with that, which you could write down as my next solvency point, not meeting standards for a control room. Again, not meeting standards for a control room. Now, I read a piece of evidence that hinted at this, but this is vital. And this is again from the Department of Energy. Quote, the integration into control room is the most challenging step in implementing DLR because, quote, the work in a control room is highly complex, end quote. And then they go on saying, adding more information to the control room may excessively tax operators, end quote. So for one, it's an added cost, and two, we don't even have standards for how this works, and because they don't have any system, because it's not in the status quo, we're just letting them scramble. What this is saying is that is directly contrary to what the affirmative team is saying, is that they have to be ready, is that even though they have to be ready, they aren't good enough at it. This is directly from the Department of Energy saying that they aren't ready because they don't have the systems in place to make this work. Therefore, the affirmative team, by not implementing any control room integration standards in their mandates, are just essentially telling the companies to go deal with it and suffer. That's not an actual federal policy that is meeting any responsible standard. The goal of the government is to take care of the people and the companies within it to ensure a strong economy and good well-being of the people. My opponents want to make energy cheap, but they're screwing the businesses and letting them suffer. In the end, that's not a responsible federal policy. They're simply shifting the responsibility to the companies and making them suffer. Now I have one more solvency point I want to address. Because in the end, this is directly conflicting with the reason why the affirmative team wants you to implement DLRs. And it's saying, in the solvency point, you could write down as worse for weather. Again, worse for weather. And this is again from the Department of Energy, which ultimately shows why they failed to meet the whole reason why the affirmative team wants to implement them. And the Department of Energy said this, quote, DLR also imposes a variety of risks in its implementation. For example, if a transmission line is scheduled to operate above its static rating due to a forecasted strong wind, but a change in weather causes a sudden drop in wind speeds in real time, the line would then be operating above its actual thermal limit. In this situation, there is an increased risk of clearance height violations, or in extreme cases, heating to the point that the material and mechanical properties of the transmission line are degraded permanently, end quote. Overall, what I'm trying to get at in the end of this speech is that a negative ballot is warranted because they failed to show they could solve, and they failed to show that they're meeting what they've even said. Thank you. I now stay open for 3 minutes of cross-examination.
3 minutes until everyone's ready? Alright, good. Alright, can I see all the evidence number?
Absolutely, it's everything worked in. You can pass that.
Alright, sweet. I'm not going to pass it yet because I don't want to do this.
Perfect.
First of all, have you brought up any real-world examples of DLRs not working?
That was not the point of my speech.
Sure.
Parker brought up examples, and I'm going to let him respond to that. I think this was a constructive speech.
Sure, but you didn't bring up any examples, right?
What I was reading is the conclusions from the
I'll
Department
take
of
that as
Energy.
a no. Can we move on? Have you responded to any of the real-world examples within the 1AC?
Again, I'm letting my partner handle the real-world examples. What I'm saying is that for it to work in America, the Department of Energy has concluded that won't work.
Sure, but can we agree that this was the last negative constructive speech?
Yes, this is the
Okay,
last
and
negative constructive
Can we
speech.
agree there are no lines across from any of the real-world examples brought up in the 1AC and therefore cannot be brought up for the rest of the round?
Any points you brought up from your last speech, my partner will be responded to.
I'm not talking
But
about the
overall,
last speech, I'm talking about the 1AC.
what I've been saying is that it's failing to meet the federally responsible standard.
All right, can we go with a yes or no question because I have other questions to get to. Can we agree that you cannot bring up any more responses to any of the real-world examples brought up in the 1AC because your constructors are over and there are no lines across from them?
I think what I've said showing that it fails to meet that standard should be enough to cross a line.
All right, interesting. Let's specifically talk about the DOE evidence. When was that evidence from?
2019 and the FERC evidence is from 2023.
All right, is FERC a good agency?
It depends on how you define good. I think that could be a good LD debate in and of itself.
Interesting. I mean, I'd love to debate it partly. I don't know how to do that. Can we agree it's generally FERC's job to regulate the transmission lines within the United States?
Yes, with some exceptions.
Sure, but like in general, just the general rule.
In general, I don't want to accept any thing where we're skipping over details, but in general, yes.
I don't want us to skip over this. Where does the cybersecurity evidence actually say dynamic line readings or DLRs?
It was all, I have the full thing. I could not read like 50 paragraphs. This was a
Gotcha.
whole DOE study on why DLRs.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, but the context does say DLRs, correct?
Yes, so the context does say DLRs, and the other one was on smart grid technology. So both are specifically.
Sure, and I want to get to the core of this argument. We can agree that the evidence said that it's vulnerable due to its communication with the controllers, or communication is the issue, correct?
I would think so. I want to read over the evidence to make sure.
Sure, I believe we'll read it. We'll confirm that in the next speech.
Okay, perfect.
All right.
I don't have it now.
Yeah, and can we agree that the evidence, or actually, I'll ask you this, not can we agree, does the evidence within the NERC standards, this NERC standards evidence, does it ever say that DLRs do not meet those standards, or does it say that there are standards for certain things like DLRs?
It says there are standards for DLRs, which is why they're failing it, because any other standards in place will not work with DLRs, and they ultimately fail those standards.
All right, thank you for your time.
Let's go back to cars because I'm really repetitive. Specifically, let's imagine that my parents really wanted me to buy a brand new car because my car was hypothetically trashed, okay? Let's assume that. Now, let's also assume my parents didn't necessarily know if I had the money or not, and just said I should take out a loan if I can't afford it. That's what the affirmative team is doing for an entire industry. It's because their plan is wholly irresponsible that I would actually urge that you side with the negative. What I'm going to be doing is responding to what he said in his last speech with some observations and some direct line-by-line responses. First of all, two observations here, though, specifically addressing something I noticed in the last cross-examination. The first is New York examples. Again, New York examples. Now, I specifically brought up a piece in my first speech that was not directly critiqued, saying that we had examples of the real-world usage of these technologies in New York. So the negative team has directly conflicting real-world applications with the affirmative. I want to make that very clear. My second observation, though, is lots of applications from other countries. Again, lots of applications for other countries. The reason why I would ask you to actually prefer the negative team in this sense is that most of the affirmative team's real-world applications have been from European countries across the globe. That's why I would give you this reason to prefer. The impact here is prefer the United States. Again, prefer the United States. Every country has a different way of distributing electricity and using their transmission lines. So I would ask that you actually prefer the United States rather than a country like Belgium. Now let's actually get into the line by line. First of all, they talk about how they're already required to implement simpler systems, so thus they will be able to implement these larger systems. A few responses here. One observation, multiple subpoints. That is the observation of the app assumption. Again, the app assumption. Subpoint A is that they can implement one sensor. Again, can implement one sensor. What the affirmative team's evidence was saying, all under this point, is that in the status quo, these companies are required to implement these less dynamic systems, these simpler systems. What their evidence did not actually say is that if we were to increase the complexity of these systems, they would actually be able to implement it. The only thing their evidence said is that they can currently implement systems, not that they can actually upgrade them. That subpoint B can implement something more complex, or just assumes complexity. Again, assumes complexity. Nowhere in their evidence does it explicitly say that these companies can actually have the experience and the know-how to implement these new technologies. All it says is that they can implement the old ones, meaning apparently we can implement the new ones. What's the two impacts here? The first is no actual evidence. Again, no actual evidence. I brought up pieces specifically talking from New York and also general studies by the government saying how these systems are hard to implement and control. They essentially just said we use simpler systems in the status quo, so they'll just be able to use them in the future. The second impact is simply app evidence disproved. Again, app evidence disproved. We've seen no real reason to actually believe they can upgrade in complexity just because they're using a simpler system in the status quo. The second observation is simply effective usage. Again, effective usage. Not only did they not actually disprove the fact that these companies can really implement these in the status quo, but also that they'll use them effectively. Again, they use the exact same reasoning as the first observation I was talking about in their ideas of effective usage. What's the impact here? Flows neg. Again, flows neg. They have actually no counter evidence to our real-world examples of when these were used and these companies use them ineffectively, like in New York. If these aren't used effectively, we won't actually be seeing that 8-to-1 cost benefit that the affirmative team has been claiming. Next, let's actually talk about that. Specifically, they were talking about how these won't cost about $1 million per line, but rather $500,000. One response, and that's simply entirely assumptuous. I know that's not a word, but I think it sounds funny. Again, entirely assumptuous. Now, what their study says is they assume that these lines cost $500,000, and that's how they got that 8-to-1 number. What the study doesn't actually say is how they got to that assumption that these lines will cost $500,000. The impact here is simply no proof. Again, no proof. There's absolutely no proof except the negative team study that actually looked at the cost of these lines, not just an assumption for a different study. Next, they talked about how they can pay for it, and simply, this is just irresponsible. Again, irresponsible. They never actually proved by burden that these companies had the upfront costs. Essentially what they said is, well, if you can't pay for it, just take out a loan. That is completely irresponsible for the federal government to do for an entire industry that keeps our nation alive. So what we see here today is that the affirmative team is irresponsible and that the negative team should be preferred. Thank you guys.
5 minutes. Jonah started off his speech by claiming that if the US federal government wouldn't do something, then you shouldn't go affirmative. It's our contention that we're not debating about what the US federal government would do, but what it should do. So let's get into proving that. Starting off with the 1 and R and addressing the big picture arguments. The first given observation about New York examples, and then the third observation about effective usage, both of them basically just harp on the New York example. A group response you can write down as outdated analysis. Outdated analysis. Notice how the study was from 2019. It was quoting a study that was even older than this. Here's why the analysis matters. Order 881, issued in 2021, said that now we have the ability to easily install DLRs. The problem in New York, as the evidence says, was with the installation and training of DLR systems, not with the actual usage of them. We've shown that those issues have since then been solved, so their real-world examples are irrelevant. But let's take a look at the reason to prefer of other countries. Our response is 1AC studies American. 1AC studies American. If you actually look at the 1A studies, they are American, they are more recent, they actually look at the real world. But let's take a look at observation 2. They said the AF assumption, they basically just said can implement one sensor. Our response here is FERC order. FERC order. No, it's not an assumption, it's literally an order from FERC, and I urge you to ask for this evidence because it specifically says they need to have the ability to easily install DLRs and operate them. This is not an assumption, this is not based on the AAR mandate, it's based on the text of the AAR mandate itself. Let's go down to the line-by-line responses. He first said entire assumptions, 2 responses. My first response is list of parts. This, it's an assumption, but it's based on the list of parts. There's a table in the context. But my second response is still unlock benefits. They completely dropped Maddox's analysis that they're still going to be unlocking the benefits because even if you double the cost, the highest end is $1 million, you still have a 4-to-1 benefit to cost ratio instead of 8-to-1. That's still significant savings. But my second response to their argument of irresponsible, you can write down as how companies work. How companies work. They basically said, oh no, we're going to make them take out loans. That's literally how companies start up in the first place. This is not irresponsible policymaking because they can convert and re-earn the benefits. But let's go down to their 1NC or 2NC. They said what we conclude, and then subpoint B, they said the reason, basically claim we need further research. That's all the evidence said. Our response is research provided. We gave the research in our 1NC, we gave the research from Belgium, which shows the concept of the physical principles of a DLR and how they work. But let's go down to subpoint C. They basically said one of many DOE conclusions, and the evidence just said standardization is necessary. Our response is provided in 1AC. If you look at the 1AC definition, it specifically lays out what types of systems are required. What systems, what algorithms, all that. The companies can decide who to hire. We're not mandating that they buy from a specific company, they make the choice. But let's go down to the impact of federal government addressing. Our response you can write down as shouldn't wait. Shouldn't wait. Here's the issue. FERC essentially just relies on utilities to decide what to do. The problem is that, as Matic pointed out, utilities don't have an incentive to implement this because they don't actually earn money from this. They only get to keep enough to pay for the systems. Here's why this matters. Every year you wait for the federal government to implement this, we lose billions of dollars, and every year you wait, you lose money on your utility bill. Let's go down to their solvency about how we're not meeting the standards. They essentially said cybersecurity, 2 responses. My first response is non-unique. If you actually look at their evidence, it says that it's an issue of communication. What's communicating in the status quo? Ambient adjusted ratings. We're not changing that. We're just changing the amount of information we're communicating. It's like sending an email with 1 line versus 3 lines. There's no cybersecurity issues. But my second response you can write down as turn more secure. Notice how we're actually changing the communication communication system to radio communication to make it more secure. This is according to Lindsay Systems, a transmission company. They say they are secure. The radio is built into the sensor and transmit only non-operational measured data directly to the dynamic line rating software. It's actually making our grid more secure than before. That's an additional advantage that we only unlock. Let's go down to the solvency point about how we're not meeting standards for the control room. 2 responses. My first response is 1AC provides. 1AC provides. The standards are pretty simple. You have algorithms do the calculation instead of having a bunch of math nerds do them for you. But my second response you can write down as companies easily follow. Companies easily follow. They completely drop Maddox analysis about, yes, the companies themselves don't know how to download the software for a DLR, but who creates the software? Companies that produce DLRs, those companies have worked in the past, they do work still, and they are able to implement these systems as we see in our real-world studies that are actually more recent. Let's go down to their final solvency. They said that it's worth for weather. My response is real-time data. Real-time data. Here's the issue. ARs actually don't always use real-time data. What does DLR use? As our mandate says, they use real-time data according to the 1AC definition. But my second response is no immediate overheating. No immediate overheating. They basically said, well, what if the wind goes away and it starts heating up? I agree, but it doesn't just immediately overheat. It has time to adjust the systems. It has time to actually keep the information accurate because that's what DLRs do. They give us more up-to-date information, they give us real-time information, and they make sure that information is accurate and solves for the harms. Please vote affirmative. Thank you.
5 minutes on the clock. My panel is ready. Alright, perfect. Again. What I'm going to be doing in this final speech is I'm going to try to wrap everything up and show you that ultimately the affirmative team is being irresponsible. And if I convince you that they don't meet the federal standards of what you think our government should be doing when they make policy, then they don't deserve your vote and a negative ballot should be voted. With that address, I have 5 voting issues. That's a big number. But I got 5 reasons why you should ultimately vote for the negative team. The first one you can write down is irresponsible company abuse. Again, irresponsible company abuse. I have a couple subpoints. Subpoint A, you can write down as de facto loan mandate. Again, de facto loan mandate. What my opponents are doing is they are requiring, and they've almost conceded this from the last speech, that companies that are already established are going to have to go back to zero and get loans and hope that the DLRs pay them back. However, that's dropping the analysis that I had in my last speech, where I said that they're not already cost effective because of how dangerous they are and how unreliable they aren't able to bring back the financial benefits. So that's subpoint B, not guaranteed return. Again, not guaranteed return. Even if the de facto loan mandate is okay, you're assuming that the DLRs return money. Now, just saying that Maddox said that in his speech doesn't mean that we didn't respond to it. We directly responded to that. Both my partner and I responded to that in our last speech. Saying that he had analysis doesn't mean that we didn't refute it. So the impact of that is protect the domestic. Again, protect the domestic. My opponent's coming up here and telling you that you need cheaper energy costs and you need a better grid is literally ignoring the fact that they are destroying the companies that are operating our grid and ultimately responsible for bringing you energy. If you don't think that's reliable at the end of the day, then they don't deserve your vote. Voting issue 2 you can write down is federal results. Again, federal results. Here's something really, really interesting. My opponents never contradicted the study. They just tried to respond to it individually. But here's some things to point out. In cross-examination, for one, they agreed that the DOE is going to understand that energy overall. Additionally, we quoted FERC, which was actually dropped. So we read from FERC in 2023 that they actually, and this was in my background point, had considerations for DLRs and were going to invest in them more, but we weren't ready for that. That leads me to subpoint A, which you can write down is needs doesn't mean you can't. Again, needs doesn't mean you can't. If I'm tied up in chains and I need to eat, but I'm still tied up in chains, that doesn't mean I'm going to eat. Saying there's a FERC order, saying that these companies need to be able to do something does not necessitate that they have the ability to do so. These companies are chained up, as the Department of Energy said. Therefore, what we ultimately can conclude from that evidence is that the Department of Energy is correct when they analyze what is under their jurisdiction, which is that these companies can't do it. Voting issue 3 you can write down as control room. Again, control room. Now, this was pretty much dropped in the last speech, but I said that control room integration goes against NERC laws because of how the standards operate. They never actually responded to the fact that it's going against the laws, which means it's pretty much been conceded because we don't get to respond to them anymore. And additionally, the control room integration for DLRs and the training and the processes it takes is huge. Going back to the FERC bill and just saying that companies need to does not actually mean they brought evidence saying that these companies are able to currently. My opponents haven't brought that evidence and therefore acknowledge that they cannot prove that to you. Now, voting issue 4 you could write down as insecure. Again, insecure. Now, this point, they outweighed with one piece of evidence that had 2 sentences. The second sentence said that this is about DLRs, and I wrote this down because it was so short. The first sentence says, they are secure, period. That was the whole thing. Literally just saying that DLRs are secure. They never explained how, they never explained what process that took. It literally just said they are secure. Full sentence. My response is that we had 2 evidence. We had a 2023 evidence and the Department of Energy study that both outweigh that this one sentence of they are secure. Ultimately, I think that should clearly flow to the negative team. Voting issue 5 you can write down as weather. Again, weather. My opponents have said that initially in their 1AC, the whole reason why we need DLRs is they don't handle the weather more appropriately. I came up here and I said that they aren't handling all weather scenarios perfectly, and they actually can result in ultimately damaging the grid greater and completely shutting it down. My opponents just saying that DLRs are supposed to protect a lot of weather things doesn't respond to this. So at the end of the day, the affirmative team has failed all the goals I've said. They're making companies pay for stuff that they agreed they're not able to, and ultimately are failing a responsible federal policy, which is why we urge a negative ballot. Thank you so much for you guys' time.
And all my panels ready? Alright, let's go ahead and get started. I'd like to start off this speech with one critical observation. This you can tag as only real-world accuracy analysis. Again, only real-world accuracy analysis. What do I mean by this? The only real-world analysis, the only real-world studies assessing the accuracy of DLRs has been brought up by the affirmative team. All of that real-world analysis is where it was implemented into, in one case, an entire country, and other cases, PhDs implementing it on individual lines. It's all shown to be accurate. The only real-world piece of evidence that they brought up was about New York, that we proved was old and that was not responded to, and we proved it wasn't actually talking about accuracy, only talking about people being able to operate it, which we also disproved. This is something that is extremely important, and I want you to keep in mind as we go through the rest of the voting sheet. Voting sheet 1 was a irresponsible company abuse. They talked about this at point A, how essentially it's a de facto loan mandate. You can take my first response is how companies work. Again, how companies work. Companies work by taking out loans. That's literally how companies get started. Companies aren't able to be profitable 100% of the time. This is some analysis I brought up, this analysis Joshua brought up, and neither of which was responded to. My second response you can tag as able to pay off. Again, able to pay off. I'd like to point out the analysis saying that we have 8 times the benefits, then the cost was completely dropped. This means even if they are taking out loans, which they may not even have to in the first place, even if they do, they are able to pay off. Let's assume that their evidence is also true, that it costs $1 million. That's still 4 times the benefit than the cost. That's helping the consumer and ensuring that the companies can pay this off. Next, they talked about how there's no guaranteed return. You can take a response as hypothetical. Again, hypothetical. Once again, this piece of evidence saying that, oh, the cost-benefit analysis isn't fully realized, this is completely hypothetical. Our evidence was a real-world study that literally lists all the parts that it costs, lists how much we save. You can look at it after the round. Second response you can tag as refuted reasons. Again, refuted reasons. The evidence they're specifically talking about gave reasons for why this might actually not realize all the cost-benefit. We refuted all of those reasons. Next, let's look down to subpoint C, where we talked about how we need to protect domestic. You can tag my response as not much. Again, not much. I'd like to point out that my response from the 2AC saying this is only 4 lines per company was completely dropped. This is not much for these companies. They're extremely rich. They're able to pay this off. Now let's move on to voting issue 2. They talk about federal results. They talk about how we conceded the DOE. You can tag my response as old. Again, old. We didn't concede that the DOE analysis was right. We said it's old. It's before the actual AAR mandate. Therefore, it doesn't actually apply. Subpoint A was about need doesn't mean you can. And you can tag my response to specifically the NERC standards point as need, not can't. Again, need, not can't. If you look to this evidence, it says that we need to meet NERC standards. It never says that DLRs don't meet NERC standards or that we can't. This is completely misrepresented by the negative team. Now let's move on to their subpoint, or my next response, which you can tag is literally required. Again, literally required. Once again, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, a government agency, literally required for these to be able to be implemented. Now let's move on to voting issue 3, which is of control rooms. So you can tag my response as algorithms, not humans. Again, algorithms, not humans. Another piece of analysis that was completely dropped within the last speech. We are using algorithms, not humans. Algorithms that are installed on the lines. They don't actually have to communicate with humans in the control room. They are algorithms. This was not responded to by the negative team. Second response you can tag is in 1AC. Again, in 1AC. They said we dropped this. The specific response Joshua gave to this is provided in 1AC. Now let's move on to their voting issue 4, which is insecure. They said it's 2 sentences. My response is explained in second. Again, explained in second. He basically dissed this evidence because it was 2 sentences. He literally says they are secure, explains why they're secure in the second sentence. He only focused on the first sentence. You can ask for this evidence after the round. My second response is non-unique. Again, non-unique. They also dropped this response, that AARs also require communication, therefore are also vulnerable to cyber attacks. Voting issue 5 was a web. You can tag my response as real time. Again, real time. This was also dropped within the last speech. What does this mean? The whole point of this technology is it fluctuates in real time. If in real time wind stops going, then the DLRs stop telling them that they can increase the capacity. That's how these DLRs work. That's what our definition says. Now let's move on to my voting issue. That is necessary action. Again, necessary action. Subpoint A is 20.8 billion lost every year. Again, 20.8 billion lost every year. This evidence was never responded to and therefore never contested. We lose $20.8 billion every year under the negative team's work. Subpoint B you can tag as homes without power. Again, homes without power. Under subpoint C of the background 1, we talk about critical power cut. That also says homes are without power. Subpoint C you can tag as conceded accuracy. Again, conceded accuracy. They never responded to any of our accuracy studies. We responded to every piece of evidence that was brought up by the negative team within this round. The impact you can tag is saved money and lives. Again, saved money and lives. Let's do some impact calculus. The negative team, their only impact is that, oh, this requires companies to take out loans. Who cares? Under our policy, you save money, $20 billion per year, and you save lives of people who usually can't get electricity. At the end of the day, that outweighs any impact the negative team has brought up within this round. Thank you so much.